The Chancellor keeps talking about tough choices, but they always seem to be tough choices for children in poverty, for migrants, for disabled people, never tough choices for multimillionaires and billionaires.
You say, if you tax the wealthy, it'll make everyone's life better. And it's not true. It's offering people false hope.
Nigel Farage says jump, Starmer says how high, and you are handing this country on a plate to Nigel Farage. So I won't take the idea that me on social media offering people hope and saying that if we redistributed wealth and power.
False hope.
It's not false hope. If we redistribute wealth and power around this country, everyone will be better.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. As Rachel Reeves prepares to deliver the budget on Wednesday, she is facing the political nightmare of having to come back for more tax, having said she wouldn't. And she's already made it clear that whatever she does, the burden will fall on all of us, not just the rich minority. But the left and the Greens are demanding a wealth tax, and the right and Reform are demanding welfare cuts and tax cuts. Voters are disillusioned, inflation is stubborn, services are still struggling, and faith in the political centre is evaporating. So how does the Chancellor land her budget without causing a political crisis for Labour or a financial crisis on the bond markets? With me today, Green Party leader Zack Polanski, Labour MP Rosie Wrighting, one of the new intake last year, and Rupert Harrison, a former advisor to George Osborne in the Treasury, and now at the US investment managers PIMCO. Thank you all very much for joining us. Zack, let's begin with the politics of inequality. You have been making the case for a wealth tax. What is it?
Well, ultimately, the Chancellor keeps talking about tough choices, but they always seem to be tough choices for children in poverty, for migrants, for disabled people, never tough choices for multimillionaires and billionaires. Since the pandemic, billionaire wealth in this country has doubled. Meanwhile, our assets, our power, our wealth has been stripped away. Ultimately, I'm saying let's take it back. And the way we do that is partly through a tax on assets. A 1% tax on assets of £10 million or more, or a 2% tax on assets of £1 billion or more could raise between 12 and 15 billion pounds. Now, it's important to say this isn't just about revenue raising. There's lots of other ways to make sure that we're spending on our capital infrastructure and investment, but ultimately making sure we're getting a grip on the huge inequality around assets has to be the principal thing that the Chancellor does this Wednesday.
So you don't want to cut spending at all. I mean, in terms of the numbers you put on it, 12 to 15 billion, you know there's a lot of scepticism around that, don't you?
Well, I think that skepticism is often from multimillionaires and billionaires and the media that they own, some of the media. So I think a lot of these narratives are pushed. I think it's quite obvious that if you tax very, very wealthy people a small amount, that will bring in a relatively large amount of money. It's always important to talk about the difference between millionaires and billionaires. I've said a few times now, but if you go back a million minutes, you're at the beginning of 2024. If you go back a billion minutes, you're at the Roman Empire. That's how deep this inequality is. And actually, we're not talking about taxing plumbers or hairdressers or small businesses at the moment, although certainly down the road, we need to have a conversation about a fairer taxation system for everyone. It seems obvious right now that the people who should pay up are the people who are doing extraordinarily well, who wouldn't even really notice this small amount of taxation, and who are making money in their sleep. And the reason why that matters is they're not earning it with their hands or their mouths or doing work every single day. These are people who are accruing that money on their assets, and that is totally unfair. It doesn't have to be that way, and we can make different political choices.
Rupert, why is he wrong?
Well, look, I don't think he's wrong in the sense that I think we will have a wealth tax of some kind in the budget. It looks very likely that the government are going to introduce, for example, higher taxes on expensive properties. I think it's quite likely there's going to be reforms to capital gains tax. There's probably going to be reforms to pensions taxation. So I think the government, partly because they've ruled out a lot of the other options, they are going to be going for these capital taxes and
that's
taxes
more
on
tax
wealth
on wealthier
and
people,
property.
but it's not a wealth
An
tax.
An actual wealth tax. So the issue is that in this situation, you want to bring in, particularly when you've got very nervous markets and you're at risk of sort of losing confidence there and therefore damaging the economy. You want to have tax rises, if you're going to raise taxes, that are predictable, bring in predictable revenue. And the problem is, on a pure wealth tax like this, there are very few international examples where anyone's actually managed to make it work to raise anything like that kind of money. So you have actually seen the Spanish government bring in a form of wealth tax. It's being debated in France. But when the Spanish example, for example, has so many loopholes to make it work, it doesn't actually raise very much money. And
is it really just beyond the Treasury to devise a tax that works?
The fundamental problem is it's not like no one's ever tried this. It has been tried. In fact, the UK tried a wealth tax about 100 years ago, and then the Treasury ended up having to pay most of the money back. The problem is that when you get to these billionaires, in particular, they're very mobile internationally. They have a choice about where to be based. And so unless you're going to do this as a part of a kind of huge international agreement, you're very vulnerable to losing the revenue and perhaps actually losing revenue rather than raising revenue if you drive those people somewhere else.
Zach?
Well, we've had wealth taxes since the Doomsday Book. So these have been a principal tradition of British politics and ultimately saying we shouldn't have this deep inequality. I'm talking about assets. Those aren't particularly mobile. And I think the really important point here is if you don't have a lot of money, if you live in poverty, you have to make decisions based on the lack of money you have. If you're very, very wealthy, then you're not just going to move because someone's asking you to pay a bit more money. That's the point of being wealthy. And I think we should be more patriotic about our country than that. People invest here because they love our country. They love the culture. They love their neighbours. They want to stay living where they're living. The idea that you ask them for 1% or 2% on their assets and they're going to move, I think has pretty been debunked. Also, I should say, Spain, the solidarity tax is working pretty well. Norway, Switzerland, the place that famously has lots of wealthy people.
They're not good
But the
comparisons.
Spanish tax is raising a fraction of the sort of
600
15
million.
billion. So
Well, let's
look,
take
it
that
might be
600
part of the
million for
mix,
a
but
start.
it's not going to
But
solve the
600
problem.
million is not going to do the things that we need to do to fundamentally change our country and
Well, we're
make
talking about
things
per
better
capita,
off.
so
But
we
make
can't
things
quite-
better off
Sorry, go on.
make things better off for families who I think about in my constituency every single day. So I think, to be honest, Zach, it is dangerous that you go on social media, you say if you tax the wealthy, if you have this tax on assets, it'll make everyone's life better. And it's not true. It's offering people false hope. It's leading them down a garden path that you cannot deliver on. And what we're doing as a Labour government is putting the policies in place that actually can change people's day-to-day lives. A breakfast club, single mum, like a family that I grew up in, can drop their child off so they can get to work on time. Raising the minimum wage. This is how you change people's lives, not by going on social media and just giving people false hope.
You seem lovely, Rosie, but you're defending a government, or you're part of a government that is keeping a two-child benefit cap, which is keeping 300,000 children in poverty, cut benefits for disabled people, some of the most vulnerable people in this country, is arming a genocide in Gaza, seems every single week to move further and further towards Nigel Farage, including with migrants and refugees. Nigel Farage says jump, Starmer says how high, and you are handing this country on a plate to Nigel Farage. So I won't take the idea
That's
that
not
me
true
on
at all.
social media offering
That's
people
not true
hope
at all.
and saying that if we
False
redistributed
hope.
wealth
I said
and power,
false hope.
it's not false hope. If we redistribute wealth and power around this country, everyone will be better.
If you sell
Everyone
people a
benefits from
policy that can't be implemented, that isn't going to bring in the revenue that you say that we need to fix our country, then that is false hope.
Why are you so sure it wouldn't bring in the revenue that Zach says?
Because of the reasons that Rupert said. When this has been tried in countries like Spain, it hasn't driven in the revenue that we need to fundamentally change
But we
our
don't
system.
compare ourselves to Spain and Switzerland in any other respect,
But also,
do we? I mean,
I'm a Labour politician. I agree with the fact that those who are wealthiest in our society should be paying into our system, should be contributing to fund our NHS. And that is why I was pleased to see in the previous budget us make decisions like closing the non-dom tax loop, putting a tax on private schools, capital gains tax. This is taxing wealth. It may not be the same clip that you can put on TikTok, but it is taxing wealth.
On the capital gains, so Rachel Reeves tinkered with it last year and it was welcome, but we still have the lowest capital gains in the G7. If we brought capital gains tax in line with income tax, the reason why that matters is right now you could be the cleaner of this building. You could be paying more tax as the cleaner than the person who owns the building. That doesn't...
as a proportion of your wealth.
Right.
Yes.
That's not natural order. That's a result of political choices. And this Labour government, a Labour government, should be making different political choices. But in every single opportunity, they protect the wealth and power of the super rich. Meanwhile, working class communities in this country are struggling badly. And it doesn't seem like in this budget they have any plans to turn this country around.
I mean, we asked a lot of businesses. We asked a lot of the wealthiest in our society. The wealthiest in our society are paying more tax since the Second World War in order to fund our NHS, in order to put our public finances back on a sustainable footing. These were Labour choices. They were fair choices. They're what the public elected us to do. And I think that we will continue to make them this week.
I mean, Rupert, the argument that's often made is that the wealthiest 1% already pay about, 30% of the tax raised
in income tax. Yeah.
In income tax. I mean, is there a limit to that? You know, and where do you get the idea of that limit from?
I mean, sadly, there is a limit. I mean,
because the point being that what we've seen is that the wealthier are relatively comfortable compared to the rest of the country, and most people can't move.
I mean,
who aren't super rich.
I have the great advantage of, unlike these two, not being a politician, so it's a bit easier for me to say, look, it's really complicated. So the truth is, it is really complicated.
It is.
The truth. So if you look, in some ways, at the UK tax system, it's already the most progressive tax system of any developed economy in terms of the ratio of tax paid by the highest earners in terms of rates to the tax paid by the lowest earners. And that's because this government and also previous governments have done things like increase the personal allowance, and we have a very high top rate of tax, 45p. And that means that we're now very, very dependent on that top 1% of earners to pay a very high, as you said, very high proportion of tax. That means, therefore, that you really need to work hard to keep attracting those top earners, make it an attractive place to build and grow a business. When it comes to capital gains tax, all the evidence and the international evidence that certainly would be the evidence taken on board, for example, by the independent OBR, that's not a political body, they're a bunch of economists looking at the data, they would say that the current top rate of capital gains tax is probably about actually the revenue maximizing rate of corporate capital gains tax, because if you start raising it higher, you'll have people moving away, and you also have people choosing not to sell assets, because you only pay capital gains tax when you sell an asset. So unfortunately, we are pushing up against the limits. There are definitely things you can do, and I expect that we will see that in the budget, things like additional council tax bans. Council tax is an absolute mess. All economists would agree it's absolutely not progressive because it's based on very outdated valuations. So I think we will see action there. But unfortunately, the government is limited by the reality of what you can raise.
See, I don't think it's that complicated. We still have the lowest capital gains in the G7. Now, look, the 50 wealthiest families in this country own more wealth than the bottom 50% of the entire population. That's 50 families versus 35 million people. And the collective wealth of those multimillionaires and billionaires, they're earning £35 million every single day. Not every week or every year, every single day. And so to hear people say there's no wealth in this country, or it's not, it's too complicated, or it's too nuanced.
I don't think we said that wealth is too complicated.
But what about that argument? Because these refrains, as you say, they're going around social media a lot. The top 50 families being so absurdly wealthy, and the top 20,000 people also, having more than £10 million in the bank. Why is a Labour government not saying there's something wrong with that?
I want to see the economy rebalanced. I want to see constituents in my constituency who work hard, work difficult jobs, are coming home still worried about the weekly shop, still worried about how they're going to pay the energy bills. I don't think that by simply a tax on assets, I don't think that's a silver bullet that the Green Party are going out on social media and selling, that's actually going to solve those problems. What I want to see is people brought out of poverty. And the only way we're going to do that is real policies that change the way this economy works.
But take on Zack's argument about property. I mean, we're very likely in this budget to see a new regime in which houses over £2 million or whatever the threshold ends up being, end up paying a higher tax every year. You could raise a lot more, couldn't you, from the super rich who've got billions in property?
I'm not going to speculate. I don't know what's going to be in the budget on Wednesday, so I'm not going to speculate on this.
The principle of taking more from that 50 people, 50 families, doesn't seem to come up.
Yeah, I think the wealthiest should be contributing to our economy in order to fund our public services. I think that's a principle that is deep rooted in Labour values and in this Labour government. I just don't think what Zack is selling people will actually do that. I think what we need to do is things that we've already announced in the previous budget, things like taxing private jets, like I spoke about, the non-dom absolute capital gains tax, private schools. This is taxing the most wealthiest in our country. And in the previous budget, we raised taxes and we asked the wealthiest in our society to hold the biggest burdens so that we could fund the NHS and make people's day-to-day lives better.
Annoyed with Zack's sort of social media promises, and I wonder whether is that because it's pulling Labour to the left into a position that is politically unsustainable?
No, I am annoyed by it, honestly, because I think that it is the exact same technique that Nigel Farage has. People have very, very difficult lives at the moment, and I know that. I hear it from my constituents. I hear it from my friends. I'm in my 20s. I know that life is difficult at the moment, and whether it's Nigel Farage or Zack Polanski going out and telling people, if we just do this one thing, your lives are going to get better, I think that's not true. I think it's dangerous, I think it's divisive, and I think it's offensive to the electorate.
I'm really honoured to be living rent-free in Labour MPs' heads because they obsess about my social media. And I'm not surprised because we're seeing thousands and thousands of people join the Green Party literally every single day. We've just hit 175,000 members, including 40,000 young people with the largest youth movement. The main thing I want to say, though, is, I just spent time with 2,000 sixth formers at Westminster Hall and just spoke to them for a long time about their futures. And they're very clear that the Labour Party are not offering what they need for the future. And I've never said that a wealth tax is the one thing that will deal with their future. You talked about bills. Let's lower people's bills. Let's nationalise the water companies. We have water companies right now pumping, I'll tell you, pumping sewage into our water and charging us extra for their privilege. The water companies are making more profit in the terms of the margins than Shell and Sainsbury's. Now, it's not going to cost any money to nationalise the water companies. I don't say that. The shareholders say that. They say our assets aren't worth anything. And we have a Labour government. Look, if this Labour government was around after the World Wars, we wouldn't have got the NHS. People would have said, it's time to invest. You would have gone, it's too difficult. You're offering people false hope. We could never do a project as big as that. There is no imagination, no vision. You only protect your vested interests, oil and gas companies, gambling companies, arms trade companies, and it's pretty much time.
Rupert,
I have no vested interest. I am someone who came into politics from a working class background. I sit here as with Labour values. As a Labour MP, I do not have vested interest.
I'm talking about your party. I have no idea about your donations, so I'm not accusing you. I'm talking about your party.
But I don't think that's fair.
I know you're not a politician, but are politicians on the right in the Conservative Party and Reform, you think, looking at this argument on the left and rubbing their hands?
Obviously, the Conservative Party are just as worried about reform as all the other parties are, I suspect. But I think that this argument is, from a centre-right perspective, is a slightly depressing argument because we're sort of dancing on the head of a pin about who can tax the rich more or who can provide sort of easy solutions. When you think about sort of businesses and investors looking at the UK, we really need to be having a conversation about stability, growth, encouraging investment. And that's sort of this huge territory which the budget hopefully will address that is slightly being missed by this kind of, I think, very narrow
And that is little measures, is it?
Well, no, I think that clearly
because to a lot of people that is like, well, that's just business as usual. And business as usual isn't working for most people, is it?
Well, it has been. Look, it's been a very difficult few years for growth. We've had, we had the COVID pandemic. We've had certainly the ongoing impact of Brexit. We have had, the energy shock. Like, clearly, it's been a very difficult period, and governments have struggled with that. Governments of both colours. But we actually face quite a dangerous moment in this country, and I think there's a kind of bigger conversation. We've got a budget that really needs to restore confidence in the UK that has certainly been shaken a little bit by events of recent months. So how restore? Well, I actually think the government will probably manage to achieve this in the budget because in the end, the Treasury is quite good at putting together budgets. And I think that they will deliver a budget that delivers more headroom against the fiscal rules, that can reassure international investors that sadly we rely on, that there's a plan to get the deficit down. And then I think that can be a bit of a clearing moment because almost the most damaging thing that we've had over the last couple of months has been just the endless speculation. This cycle every 6 months of speculation, driven really by the decision to have such a small amount of headroom against the fiscal rules, means that every 6 months we're back in a situation where families don't know what tax they're going to be paying, businesses don't know what tax they're going to be paying in a few months' time, people saving for pensions or investments for the future don't know. And that has a freezing effect on investment. So I think it's, certainly international investors will be hoping that this budget sort of slightly draws a line in the sand, establishes a clear plan to get the deficit down and puts to bed a lot of this speculation so you can just have some basic stability, which is the kind of first basic ingredient for getting, decent growth back in the economy. I
mean, that sort of opens up the other big argument, I suppose, that would be between the two of you about international investors and the bond markets. Zack, you seem to be saying we shouldn't worry about the bond markets in the last couple of days.
I don't think
and saying that debt to the Bank of England isn't real debt.
I think we should be worrying about people in this country who elected the politicians. So I'm talking about cleaners, teachers, nurses, the people who are actually generating the income in this country and the well-being of this country. I'd object to the characterisation of the Labour government as on the left. They're giving fossil fuel subsidies £3.2 billion. That is destroying this planet. We have one of the most nature-depleted countries on Earth.
All right, but let's talk about the bond market.
Well, absolutely. Well, this all links in because ultimately it's about selling out our nature, selling out our communities to the bond markets, as opposed to going a politician's principal job should be about protecting people and planet. Now, on the debt and the deficit, it's not that it's completely irrelevant. It's just that ultimately the question always is, we talk about borrowing and borrowing to invest, but who are you borrowing from? A lot of that money is from the Bank of England. We literally owe it to ourselves. A lot more of the money is from foreign countries. It's stored as assets because...
But when you say we owe it to ourselves, what are you suggesting? Are you saying we can write it off? Or that we can just print more and it's fine?
Well, you don't print money in that same way anymore. We know it all happens on computers and it's digital. And effectively, it's basically simple Keynes, really. What I'm saying is anything we can do, we can afford. The limitations, because there are rules, are inflation based on the amount of resources
we have. So we could just keep making more money and spending it?
Up until the point that we have inflation or we run out of resources. But by the way, we have much more important boundaries. And the boundaries are ecological boundaries and climate boundaries. So we both have to watch inflation in terms of making sure that everyone is employed properly, we have enough resources to do the things we want to do. But investing in hospitals, investing in schools, investing in infrastructure, that's exactly what our country should be doing. And I think decades of austerity has programmed people's minds with we don't deserve better or we can't have alternatives. But actually making sure we're investing in our communities is the exact way to keep the economy moving. What we're getting from both these panelists, I would say, is different forms of trickle-down economics, which has been demonstrated over and over again to fail. And crucially, people die as a result.
So Rupert,
that's how serious these consequences are.
If Zack was delivering the budget on Wednesday, how would the bond markets react?
Well, Zack has just set out something called modern monetary theory, which is a sort of idea that you don't need to worry about bond markets or deficits. And it's a little bit like the last 5 years with inflation and high yields never happened. This was an argument that we had during the previous decade, the sort of after the financial crisis up until 2020, when central banks were doing QE, i.e. they were buying up government debt, interest rates were zero, and then there was an argument about whether governments could boost economies by spending and borrowing. But the difference is that, as Zack said, we have had the last 5 years, we've had a big inflationary surge, we've now got interest rates quite high, and in this country, in the UK, we still have inflation stubbornly above target. So if you tried that approach now, we actually saw the risks of that with the Liz Truss budget. If you tried that approach now of deliberately going out to if Rachel Reeves said, I'm going to junk my fiscal rules, I'm going to spend and borrow more, actually that would result in the Bank of England having to raise rates further. That would basically undo any positive economic impact because they have
just
to
lay out,
bring
because not everyone is an
economist.
What does that actually mean? It means the government paying a lot more for its debt.
It would mean the government, not only the government paying a lot more for its debt, but actually the rate that the government pays for its debt sits underneath every other interest rate in the economy. So every interest rate that a business pays to borrow to invest or that someone pays on their mortgage sits on top of the interest rate that the government pays. So if you go out and borrow and spend in an inflationary high rate environment, you will see higher interest rates, not just for the government, but that matters because we all pay that debt interest through our taxes.
And we would see the graph.
We pay more on debt interest than we do for education.
It would go through the ceiling this time.
So we know these risks. So I think we've got to confront these risks, understanding that the last 5 years have happened. This is a different world now. And that's why, this market constraint is something that we as a country have created by choosing to borrow billions of pounds from markets.
So Zack, how do you escape that market
Well, we need to be
constraint?
clear if we're talking about primary bond markets or secondary bond markets. But more importantly, the Liz Truss example is the opposite example. Liz Truss borrowed money under your frame to fund unfunded tax cuts. I'm absolutely not saying that's what we should do.
Actually,
it's the opposite.
The markets were, if anything, more worried about the massive borrowing she was doing to fund spending on the energy subsidy scheme. So it was a mix of very, very large spending plans together with tax cuts.
Just a couple of days after Liz Truss and everything settled down. The Bank of England could have adjusted
she had to fire her chancellor and reverse all the policies.
But you're making it's the problem around the Bank of England independence. And actually, I think the conversation we nearly... Sorry.
No. I mean, I'm just trying to work. Are you saying that interest rates wouldn't go up? Or are you saying it doesn't matter if they go up?
I'm saying it matters in terms of making sure we're relating it to resources. We've had years of trickle-down economics, and we're in the exact situation we were just talking about.
I know that's the argument, but if you've got all the people in the markets and people like Rupert saying the interest rate would go up if you did that.
But of course, the people in the markets will say that.
How do you escape that trap?
The question you're really asking me is, are very wealthy individuals worried that what I'm talking about is not moving our public wealth to private capital, which has been happening for decades now, but keeping it as our public wealth and spending it on our communities? When we talk about deficit, what we're really talking about in deficit is money that has gone to our communities. If we talked about surplus, what we're really talking about is where we're not spending money on our communities. So we need to completely change this economic paradigm. Now, I know that's going to be difficult for people because that's a completely different way of looking at the economy. So let's keep it very simple. What I'm talking about is spending multipliers, which have existed in our economics for a long time. For every pound you spend, the economy gets money back.
But this is not a new invention.
But
exactly. Can I just say environmental spending? For every pound you spend, you get £1.88 back into the economy.
Sorry,
it doesn't
to go
make
back
sense.
To the economics.
Austerity never makes sense.
So this multipliers issue. So again, this is an argument that we had pre-2000. When you have low inflation and low rates, there's an argument about whether multipliers are high. The problem is when you've got inflation above target, the multipliers are basically zero. In in the Keynesian sense, which is any money the government borrows to spend is going to be more than offset by the Bank of England having to raise interest rates because it's got to get inflation back to target. So this really feels like an argument that's sort of out of date. Like I didn't realize that the inflation happened and that rates are high. We live in a different world. And sometimes this gets framed in terms of democratic choices, like the bond market is sort of undemocratic.
It is.
Like, there is a legitimate democratic choice, which maybe, the politicians on the left might want to take, which is you could raise taxes to raise spending. That's a very deliberate democratic choice. And if you can get people to vote for that, that's absolutely fine. Unfortunately, you don't have a democratic right to borrow hundreds of billions of pounds from overseas investors. To do that, you have to be credible and you have to persuade them that you're going to pay them back.
But notice for credibility and persuasion, because really what we're talking about here is trust. And what politicians
100%.
need to be doing is telling different stories and making sure that the markets understand the stories they're telling. A big problem we've had, and we've really got it with Rachel Reeves right now, and I do agree with what you said a few moments ago, that part of a huge problem here is the uncertainty, that we seem to be swinging all over the place and there doesn't seem to be a vision and a plan. Now, look, I'm not an economist. I'm not going to pretend to be an economist, but I talk to economists regularly, and what they're saying more than anything is there needs to be clarity about what all of these terms mean. And the fundamental problem in all of our conversations about economics is the constant fixation of comparing a household budget to the national economy. It doesn't work like that. And a few years ago, it felt, particularly in journalism, we were having different conversations about how the economy works. It just feels like that's rolled back. And over again, we hear this narrative.
But it also
that we've got to
feels
tax
sometimes,
defense.
though, that's some sort of magic political message. And actually, there is such a thing as money in and money out. And debt that needs to be repaid.
To a point, let's give an example. We had a pandemic in this country and we created the money to respond to the crisis, and that was the right thing to do. We are in a crisis right now. We're in a crisis of inequality. We're in a crisis of climate. Ultimately, we need to be spending money to make sure that we're borrowing to invest, if that's the phrase we're using, or we're spending to invest, because ultimately austerity is the one proven thing to absolutely not work and to ultimately end people's lives.
We're going to come to
children.
austerity soon, and the whole question of welfare cuts. And obviously Rupert's got an interesting perspective on that, having been around George Osborne during austerity. But Rosie, is this sort of more snake oil from your point of view?
Yes, and I think that we need to be clear what will actually happen to people. Because there's been a lot of technical talk, but what will happen if we go to the markets? If Zack was delivering this budget and we went to the markets and we massively increased borrowing, it would mean families in my constituency would pay more on their mortgages. We saw that under Liz Truss. There is a real human impact of just going to the markets, going and just borrowing. We saw it under Liz Truss. Yes, that was for partly for tax cuts rather than spending, but still it would have the same impacts. And when I knocked on doors, to be honest, when I still knock on doors in my constituency, the devastation caused by Liz Truss's, frankly, her trickle-down economics, which we will not return to, is still felt in families' day-to-day lives.
But long-term interest rates went back up to beyond Liz Truss levels.
Yeah, but
after that.
Yeah, the damage caused sets in. I have friends who got on the housing ladder and then had to sell their houses to go back into rented accommodation because of the impact of Liz Truss's mini budget on their mortgages. That impact is still felt day to day in people's lives, and we would see the same thing under Zack's economics.
I mean, what Rosie's worrying about here is essentially debt to GDP ratio, which is about 100% in our country. In Japan, it's 270%. Japan has a much more equal economy than we do.
Japan
and a much
has massive
better
problems with their economy.
Of living.
Massive
They have other
problems.
problems too, but in terms of making sure we're tackling inequality and getting a better standard of living, these scare stories
also
of bogeymen.
it's the speed
I think
of
the
the
other
debt.
real issue we have from the Labour government is this constant focus on GDP. Simon Kuznets, the person who designed the idea of GDP, says this is a terrible way to measure the health and well-being of the country. We should actually be talking about mental health. We should be talking about equality. We should be talking about communities that feel like they're cohesive and they live with purpose. This constant focus on economic growth as the priority and the only measure is destroying our country.
Rupert?
I don't want to come back and be the economist here, but Japan is in first of all, a very dangerous situation. So Japan is now seeing its interest rates rise and pressure on its currency because international investors are starting to say, well, this 200+% of GDP debt maybe was sustainable when your interest rates were zero. But what does it look like now that your interest rates are normalizing? So it's still running a risk for the future. Japan is also, again, this is a bit complicated, but Japan is in a very different situation because it is a current account surplus country. So Japan exports far more than it imports. And therefore, it doesn't need, in a kind of national sense, to be sucking in capital just to live on a year-by-year basis. The UK is structurally a deficit country, and so markets are going to be much, much less tolerant of high debt to GDP in countries like the UK, which is what you can see in the market reaction to the Truss episode, or more recently to some of the wobbles, and what you're seeing in countries like France, where, again, concerns over fiscal sustainability are having real impacts on interest rates.
So can I move us on to spending then? Because obviously from the right, the demand is you need to cut spending. You helped guide Britain through austerity, or partly the architect of austerity. I mean, do we need another period now of massive cuts?
I mean, look, I think that the immediate challenge is one of confidence. And like, can this budget, as you know, we've all talked about the uncertainty of this period, like, can you get a budget that, in a sense, is a kind of clearing moment that provides certainty for markets, certainty for business, and then the government can focus on its priorities, people can focus on investing for the future. I think that from the point of view of international investors coming back to the markets who we do borrow the money from, they would want to see anything that's predictable and reliable and sustainable. And that's why, if there were credible reductions in spending, particularly on the welfare side, where people can see the welfare bill, especially for health and disability benefits, rising very rapidly, if there were a credible way to even limit the rise there, we're not necessarily talking about reducing the scale, I think that would be seen as credible and permanent. That's another reason why markets, when it came to tax rises, I think took the view, and most economists took the view that, well, if you're going to raise tax, probably raising income tax. No one likes paying more tax, but it's predictable, it's less distortionary, the revenues are going to be reliable. The government's now ruled that out. The challenge for the government is to put together a package. The challenge for Rachel Reeves is to put together a package, which I think maybe will include something on the spending side, but also if it's going to be tax rises that are predictable, reliable, and going to bring in the revenues. Because again, if you're just, dealing with novel tax rises where you don't necessarily know they're going to deliver the revenues, that's where some of that uncertainty might remain.
But when you look back at what happened, I mean, obviously a lot of people think we are still living with the consequences of austerity, that the impact on public services, on the wealth gap, on poverty, on child poverty is partly as a result of austerity. I mean, do you accept that now?
Well, austerity means different things to different people. So, the period I was in government, 2010, 2015, that was really dealing with an economic crisis in 2010. So this was not, we were borrowing, the government was borrowing £1 in every 4 that it spent was borrowed from international markets. The UK had a budget deficit of more than 10% of GDP, worse than the fiscal situation we're in now. And it was a moment of genuine crisis for the UK. And that's why you had a coalition government. It wasn't an ideological approach. You had Liberal Democrats and Conservatives in coalition saying, well, we're going to do a combination of tax rises. Remember, that government raised VAT, raised more than £10 billion for raising VAT.
But do you think you envisage the long-term impact?
Well, I think that there's a democratic argument about what's the right level of tax and spending on public services, and certainly as you said, I was a Conservative candidate at the last election. I certainly heard on the doorstep people saying, well, look, we look at public services and they're not good enough, and I think that a lot of the impact of that was maybe related to the pandemic, but certainly there was a democratic choice, I think, at the election, which was like, actually, we're willing to pay more taxes, even though the Labour Party said it wouldn't raise taxes. In my experience, all the voters expected that they would. And I think there was a decision by the voters to elect a Labour majority, a very large majority, to have a bit higher taxes and more investment in public services.
So, Rosie, I mean, you placed great store in what the markets think. And what Rupert's saying is being said by all the investment managers, that, there has to be some credible cuts in spending as well. I mean, do you agree with them on that as well?
No, I mean, I think that the years and years of cuts that we had to our public services is why we see the inequality that we see, why the country is in the place it's in. I think that if you don't fund our NHS, you will have people on welfare because they're waiting to get a hip replacement. I think if you don't fund education properly, you're not giving young people the opportunity they need to go into their work and then contribute to our economy. I think getting the welfare bill down is a separate conversation because personally, I think there's a moral case for it. I think that 1 in 8 young people not in education or work is an absolute damning legacy of the previous Conservative government and needs to be something that we address. Work can be a really, really good thing and we need to talk about that more. But I do not think, and I don't think under this Labour government, we should go back to seeing cuts to our public spending.
So any reduction in spending has to be couched as not a cut, is what you're saying?
Well, like I said, I think welfare, there's a moral case for it. And I really do. I think that there are people that we've let be out of work who want to get back into work, who want the opportunity.
But does that mean
to
compulsion?
try work.
Forcing people off benefits?
No, I think it's by, like with the TIMS review, making sure that we can create an environment that people feel as though they can try work and not fear losing their benefits, or they feel like there's a work that will work for them around their life. I think there's a lot to it. I think it's complicated, but there's a moral case to get this welfare bill down in this country.
Why do you think so many young people are going on to health and disability benefits at the moment? I mean, do you think they all are disabled and unwell?
I think there's a range of issues, to be honest. I think that if you leave education and you go on to welfare, and you're on welfare for quite a long time, I don't think there's challenges of getting back in to the workplace, and we've seen that. I think that it partly because of cuts we saw under the previous government to education, people have left school not feeling necessarily ready for a modern workforce, and they struggled. Of course, a rise of mental health problems, and again, this could be a whole separate podcast, I think, talking about that. But also cuts that we saw under the previous government to our NHS that meant people haven't been able to get access to healthcare in their communities. They haven't been able to look at prevention instead of cure. And you can't see that more clearly than with mental health services.
But I mean, there are plenty of people, on the reform side of politics who are essentially saying, I mean, not as bluntly as this, but that they're skivers.
I would never use that language.
Obviously you wouldn't, but I mean, that's the argument you're up against as well.
I think that there are people that could be in work that aren't, and then maybe they aren't in work because they're scared of losing their benefits, which, by the way, is a valid reason. They're scared of losing their benefits. They're scared that work isn't going to be economically viable for them, or they're just scared that work isn't going to be good for their mental health, or they're not able to find a job that works around what they're facing day to day. I think that's all valid.
How damaging was it for the credibility of the government to deliver any of these changes, given they've already had to row back on the welfare cuts they attempted?
Well, I personally was for the government reforming welfare. Like I said, I think there's a moral case for it. And I hear that from my constituents, by the way, quite a lot. People saying, look, I work hard and I feel like I want the person next door to me.
What were your colleagues saying, in opposition?
There was, the public could see this, right? There was mixed views in the backbenches. And
do you think they've got to kind of get real now? Or?
I think the TIMS review is a good forum for backbenchers who have concerns, and everyone represents different constituencies and sees different, and may want to feed in different information, so that we have the time to have that review to then come at this properly that reflects the concerns of the backbenchers. But as I said, I was someone who was for reforming welfare. I don't think we can continue how it is.
Zack?
Up is down, left is right. Poverty is not a lack of character. It's a lack of money. And to have someone who's working in a department that's privatising the National Health Service, who is cutting spending in real terms, and go, we should not be cutting spending, is very much the definition of saying one thing and doing another.
What do you mean they're privatising the health service?
Well, during the general election, I had a debate with Wes Streeting, and I talked about that they have a plan to privatise it. He put his arm up at me and said, the left are bleating on again. But we've seen it over and over again. Not only are they accepting money from private healthcare companies, are looking at more and more ways of reducing the spending.
So you genuinely believe that we want an NHS that's not free at the point of use?
Yes, I do believe that. I think as quickly as possible that you're doing that.
I think that's a shocking narrative to tell people.
Well, I think we're seeing over and over again the reduction in real-term spending on the National Health Service, the allowance of corporate companies and more private healthcare companies to take contracts. This has happened both with the previous Conservative government, but we've seen it accelerate.
You see, Labour used to say this about the Conservatives, and the answer was always surely it would be political suicide to remove
Which is why they
it's a part of our country's DNA.
So it's kind of a mad accusation, isn't it, to say Labour
it's not an
to
accusation.
make
It's
people
literally
pay.
what they're doing when you look at the figures in terms of real-term spending and in terms of where that money is going to. It's going to private healthcare. And then also, I didn't realise you'd been a Conservative candidate, but I just think we can't take lectures or moral lessons, or not even moral lessons, but economic lessons from a Conservative government that absolutely devastated this country. I don't think it can be overstated how brutal that Conservative government was, alongside the 5 prime ministers who increasingly reduced spending. Increasingly, we saw poverty on the rise. We've seen people homeless. We've seen people struggle to eat. And then the fact that a Labour government came in on a promise of change, but any change we've seen has arguably made things worse. I think that's why we're seeing the so-called centre collapse because there is no vision, there's no real offer, there's just saying one thing and doing another. And I think people are over it. And actually, that's why people want hope to feel normal again, because actually they're looking to a party in the Green Party who are actually saying, we will invest in your communities. We won't accept corporate donations, these big multimillionaire and billionaire contracts.
Rosie?
I think what we're risking in this country, because we are at a fork in the road, there is a party, Reform UK, that are waiting in the wings to come in, and they genuinely want to move our NHS to an insurance-based system. They want to privatise our NHS. It is a Labour government that invented the NHS.
They also say that they would have free healthcare at the point of delivery, don't they?
I think they've gone back and forth. I think they've said one thing one day, one thing the other. I think it's uncertain what they would do to our NHS. I think our NHS is at risk at the hands of Nigel Farage. It's a Labour government that created the NHS. It's a Labour government that's increased investment in the NHS. It's a Labour government that's got our waiting times down. We promised 3 million appointment, we've delivered 5. I think it is dangerous when we know the risks that are waiting in the wings with Nigel Farage and what he would do to our NHS, that you say that a Labour government is privatising the NHS and doesn't want an NHS free at the point of use. That is against our DNA. It's against what I stand for.
Are you giving more contracts to private healthcare or not?
I don't personally, I don't know the details, and I think you could look at all different aspects of healthcare and talk about them all separately.
So do you think we're reducing contracts for private healthcare?
That a Labour government will always have an NHS that is free at the point of the use.
It can be free at the point of use and it can still
But that's not privatising the NHS.
Well, ultimately it is, because it means that we, as the public, are being ripped off because the money that is going to those private healthcare companies.
But that is not the same as what you just said. You said Labour want to privatise the NHS.
Well, that would be privatising. You'd literally be giving it to private companies.
You said that Labour don't want an NHS free at the point of use. I just asked you, I said, does Labour want an NHS free at the point of use? And you said no.
I think that's where they want to get to. But where we are right now is we are seeing the privatisation in terms of the active verb. You are privatising the National Health Service.
I think it's dangerous what you're selling to the electorate,
I think it's more dangerous what the government are doing to people.
Is waiting in the wings. I really do.
Rupert, take on the criticism of the Conservatives as well.
Well, I think it's not really for me.
Austerity
it's not really for me to sort of defend a government I wasn't part of. But I think that if I could take a step back and sort of put my hat on as an investor in the UK, I think that this conversation is something that we should pay very close attention to, because while I do think that most people would expect that in the short term, the budget will be a bit of hopefully a clearing moment if there can be a credible plan to deal with the deficit, restore a bit of stability. Increasingly, talking to international investors in the UK, the thing that comes up as a future risk is political stability and the future politics. And certainly, investors have long time horizons, and they certainly see the polls, and they're looking ahead to Nigel Farage, the possibility of a reform government. I think it's very interesting, actually, that in just the last couple of months, even Reform, who had, certainly a very sort of fiscally irresponsible manifesto at the last election, £90 billion of unfunded. They've had to backtrack on that. And you've got Nigel Farage saying, no, everything will be paid for. You've got Richard Tice uses a phrase like performance-related tax cuts, which I think is him deliberately trying to learn the lessons of the Liz Truss episode and say we won't cut taxes if we can't afford it. And so I think that the bond market and international investors have noticed that and said, okay, well, maybe that's a risk that's maybe kind of reduced.
So do you think they will currently see Reform as more stable than the Greens?
Well, I think that the issue now is that I think that the issue of leadership in the Labour Party has been raised over the last couple of months because of, all these briefings and stories. And I don't want to get into political tittle-tattle because that's not my role, but international investors have certainly noticed that risk. And I think that the kind of pressure on Labour from the left, from the Greens, and the risk that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves could be replaced within Labour by a new leadership that might turn to the left, that might be a little bit less fiscally responsible, is something that is already starting to raise a risk premium for the UK. And you can see that a little bit on the kind of longer part of the interest rates that we pay.
So a soft left Labour leader like Andy Burnham or something, that would ring alarm bells.
The point I'm trying to make is we live in a dangerous world now. We live in a dangerous world with high interest rates, volatile macroeconomy, hugely unpredictable international policy from the Trump administration. I think that, be very careful the impact that these political discussions have on real world consequences for people's mortgages and businesses, because this kind of talk is not free. People are listening, not just your listeners on Channel 4, but actually the world is listening.
So just to be clear on this, in terms of what the bond market's like, are you saying they would like Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves to stay in place?
Certainly. I think that uncertainty, markets don't like uncertainty. They would like to see predictable revenues. They'd like to see a strong government delivering a plan. Absolutely. The risk of, as I say, I'm not raising this because this is something that now gets raised very regularly in discussions, investment discussions about the UK, ever since really Number 10 put it on the agenda themselves with all that briefing a couple of weeks ago. So I think that, we have to now, think that this kind of speculation has real consequences given the world we live in, and has real consequences right now.
How in peril do you think Rachel Reeves is on Wednesday, and how it unravels or not?
Well, first of all, to Rupert's point, I would agree. I think political stability does have real implications to our markets, and actually, who feels the brunt of that is always families and the everyday person who I think of in my constituency. I think I'm not going to comment on Rachel Reeves' specific position.
Why not? I mean. But Number 10 is literally, they were literally briefing about Labour leadership a few days ago. I mean,
and I don't think briefing is helpful, and I think but
it's a real debate. You can't deny that if she gets this wrong, she's finished, isn't she? I mean,
and I think there's a lot at stake at this budget, but I think there's a lot at stake. I'm not thinking about the leadership of the Labour Party. I'm thinking about the people in my constituency who want better lives. And to be honest, like I said, we're at a fork in our roads for this country. So I think there's a lot at stake to make people feel better off, to make the cost of living crisis not feel so prevalent in people's day-to-day lives. Families who I think of, like I said, every single day. The mum who drops her kid off at school and now can drop a kid off a free breakfast club, who can take the other kid to childcare, which they now have 30 hours free, can go and get a good job. I think about those people every single day, and it's that I care about. The leadership of the Labour Party, we can talk about it over and over again, but ultimately it's delivering for people that matters.
It is very likely that you come through this budget, if Rupert's right, that things stay reasonably stable, there's no panic on the bond markets, you get through it, but you lose political support because ordinary people's taxes go up. They're already feeling squeezed. There's no hope on the horizon for them. Yeah. And you are plummeting. In that scenario, Labour MPs will start talking about getting rid of Keir Starmer.
Well, I think in this budget we need to make Labour decisions that make this country fairer. And those people that you just spoke about, I think that we need to think about them in the forefront of our minds when, like I said, I'm not in the Treasury, I'm not Rachel Reeves.
But they're all going to be worse off next week.
I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. This is a Labour government. I don't think that's true.
It's not migrants that bankrupted this country. It's not the left that bankrupted this country. It's not people who are claiming universal credit, many of whom are in work. Their just work is not paying enough. And that's a really key point here.
That's why we increased the minimum wage.
The people who bankrupted this country are the bankers. The people who have bankrupted this country are decades of Tory politicians and now Labour politicians and their austerity that hasn't worked. And it's time to change course.
And do you see the political instability as a good thing for change?
Well, I think we do need political stability. I don't think anyone's coming on this and saying political instability is a good thing.
But it's helping you, isn't it?
Well, it's helping in terms of people are recognizing that what is happening right now doesn't work. The only thing that will maintain right now is the status quo. So I think people watching this have a decision to make. Are we going to allow that status quo through the Labour government to gradually go further and further to the right and end up with Nigel Farage or something even worse as time goes on? Or are we going to say, time to change course? The Green Party are there. I'm not pretending we have all the answers.
Yeah.
What I am saying is what we are doing right now isn't working. And this is absolute madness.
But are you caught?
You keep saying, let's double down. And you keep talking about the bond markets being scared and terrified. But I think we've got to worry less about the bond markets and more about the people in our working class community.
I suppose I'm talking about the system we are currently living in. You want to change that world. Fine, I get that. But are you also, to some extent... That
can be dismissed, but I do think the current system that we're in hasn't always been this way. Since Thatcher, neoliberalism came in, and that's what we're suffering now. So what I'm saying isn't some kind of fantasy or idea that we've never had before. I'm talking about what happens in most of Western Europe, and also what we had before Thatcher kind of destroyed any kind of sense of social cohesion.
But I wonder whether you're also slightly surprised by your own popularity at the moment, and whether it's making you think about some of these economic issues more seriously. I mean, Rupert mentioned, Reform have clearly tacked back from some of the more eccentric ideas they were throwing out in their contract and the last election. Are you also having a lot of meetings saying, well, we've got to get our ducks in a row here and stop saying things that spook people. I mean, you spooked people yesterday a little bit, to be honest, on Laura Kuenssberg's show when you talked about, it's money we owe ourselves, and people thought,
this is important.
Does this man not know how the system works?
Well, who did I spook? I spooked establishment figures, multimillionaires and billionaires, and people who are very wealthy, who surprisingly don't like the idea, many of them, that I want to tax the wealthy, and so they're finding ways to attack the Green Party. Look, I'm really privileged and honoured that the Green Party right now are shooting up in the polls. I think in the last poll, I had the highest net favourability ratings of any party leader. And I also accept that's a total responsibility. The Green Party have gone from a party where we were fighting to get some airtime to say things to a party where I can't stop doing interviews and being given a platform. I always have more to learn. I always have more to discover. So I'm not pretending I know everything. What I am absolutely certain of, and so certain of, is that multimillionaires and billionaires own many of our newspapers, own many of our TV channels, and ultimately those people have a very vested interest in trying to discredit any idea or story that challenges the status quo. And the one thing I'm certain of, and people tell me every single day, is the status quo is not working, it is broken, and Labour ultimately exists right now to protect power and wealth in this country, and that's before we even get to the tourism reform. We need a complete clear out of that broken politics. We need something new, different and hopeful, and that's what I'm offering.
I mean, I would just say it certainly wasn't billionaires and millionaires who brought down the Truss government who was cutting the top rate of tax. It was reality. And so you've got to differentiate between, billionaires and millionaires and reality. And unfortunately, it would be great if we could worry less about the bond markets. But to do that, we'd have to run a budget surplus. So let's raise more taxes for the spending that you want. Unfortunately, I think that the reality is more important, and that confronting reality and providing a bit of confidence to the world that the UK takes reality seriously.
Well, you're getting to a point here, because the reality is the status quo. And what I'm saying is your reality is not working. And I think enough people in this country, more and more, are going, actually, I don't believe that. We've been told this over and over again on TV channels and in newspapers, and the difference is happening. Communities are coming together, people are organising and going, let's have a different political and economic system. And that's what's coming. I want to make sure Nigel Farage isn't in charge of that. I want to make sure communities are.
Zack talks about, we all on this panel don't want political instability. But I think the Green Party and the Reform UK have the exact same technique. They are going online, often, TikTok, they're speaking directly to people. They're telling them
how awful
lies.
Of me to talk directly to people.
I have TikTok. No, but you're telling them lies. And
no,
that is awful.
Can you name one lie I've said?
Yeah, that a wealth tax would change this country.
I've never said that.
No, but that's what you're telling people.
I've said a wealth tax would reduce inequality in this country.
That is what you're telling people.
Do you not believe a wealth tax would reduce inequality? Because it seems fairly basic.
I think there's lots of policies that would reduce inequality.
Would a wealth tax reduce inequality,
and the Labour government
Rosie?
are implementing
You've accused me of a lie, so would a wealth tax reduce inequality?
Let me just finally ask you, Rosie, because a lot of people will also be a bit alarmed because of the way politics is changing in Britain at the moment, that a lot of people are wondering whether the only future for the centre and the centre-left and the left is for you to work together to stop reform at the next election. And looking at this conversation, it's not looking very likely at the moment. I mean,
I want people's lives to get better. I don't want the cost of living crisis to continue to burden families. That's what I think of. We can come on a panel like this and we can have the political debates, but ultimately I want to see the policies implemented, the choices made that make things better for the ordinary family, the family that I was brought up in, that my life has been good. I've had opportunities because of what the last Labour government did for my childhood. And I want this Labour government to do the same for children growing up. But I don't think we're going to be able to do that with this divisive politics that we see.
But if a progressive alliance is the only chance at the next election, are you up for it?
I think the chance of the next election is delivering for families. And I think that's what we'll do.
Thank you all very much indeed for joining us. That was fascinating. I hope you enjoyed that. That's it for this episode of The Fourcast. Until next time, bye-bye.